My fellow Catholics, welcome to LatinRiteMass.org. I'm your host, João Machado, and this episode is entitled Catholic Church Statistics Worldwide Edition 2014. If you have not had a chance to watch the previous video entitled Catholic Church Statistics 2014, Fruits of Vatican II, I would recommend that you watch that one first. Everywhere you look, you see that number. 1.2 billion Catholics. Everywhere. They keep touting that number as if that's the holy grail of numbers. Number of Catholics. 1.2 billion. But what does that mean? The implication is that it means 1.2 billion faithful Catholics, as if it's one unified front, one army of faithful against the world. And what I'm going to show you is exactly the opposite. Think about it for a moment. How is it that we keep being told that every year new Catholics are coming in? 14 million this year, 15 million that year. How can that be if we have all these new Catholics coming in, but yet the churches are empty in Europe? And they're closing down churches in the United States left and right. Where are those Catholics going? Before we dive right into it, I'd like to point something out. On the website for CARA at the Georgetown University website, there is data that's been redacted for First Holy Communions, First Confirmations. I mean, there's redacted data that should be there. Another redacted means that it's been blacked out so that you can't see it. And we only started seeing data for First Holy Communions and confirmations in 1990. Why is that? Because they have the data. All Catholic churches are required to supply that data every single year, usually in September, October, if I remember correctly. So why is that data being blacked out? It's even, and also in the section for the United States, same thing. It's being blacked out. So it makes you wonder, why was that data blacked out? World Catholic population versus world population. Now the orange line down at the bottom there, that's the Catholic population, allegedly. And of course the blue line is the world population, and that's from 1970 to 2014. Do you see anything odd about this? Those lines at the very minimum should parallel each other. But what's interesting is that the world population of Catholics, number of quote-unquote baptized Catholics, from 2010 to 2014 did not move. 1.2 million 2010, 4 years later, 1.2 billion, and then 4 years later, 1.2 billion again. Now, a population that's growing grows exponentially. In other words, as long as the parents are having more than 2 children, it's growing. The church grows. That's how population growths happen, is because people have more than 2 children. They replace not only themselves, but they leave more for the next generation. That's how a population grows. And right now, with the medical advances we've had in the last 50 years, that's actually helped that growth of population worldwide, because we have an aging population. So how is it that in 4 years span, there is no growth? Something does not make sense. Catholic priests worldwide. If we are to believe these numbers from CARA's website, it would indicate that from 1970 to 2014, the number of priests hasn't budged. How can that be? How can you supposedly double the amount of Catholics and nearly double the population of the world, but yet you still have the same amount of priests? We can deduce one thing from this very clearly. The average age of priests worldwide is very high. And with that means that there's going to be a tremendous drop-off in the number of priests in the next 5, 7, maybe 10 years at the most. Religious brothers and sisters, this is the saddest thing a Catholic can look at. We went from 1 million religious sisters in 1970 to 700,000 in 2014. And that falls right in line with the same stats in the United States. It's almost the same line. This truly is sad. Catholic marriages worldwide. This is a disturbing graph on many different levels. But the number of Catholic marriages has been on the decline for the last 20 years. 30 years, actually. How can that be? How can we have such growth in Catholics, but the number of Catholic marriages decrease? In other words, the number of marriages that people are getting married in the church. The revert rate must be through the roof. Now let's look at the sacraments in the church worldwide. Now, once again, I have to remind you that the data for First Communions and confirmations between 1970 and 1985 has been redacted. So they blocked it out. Why? It can't be good if they're blocking it out. That's all. I think that's all we can say. If they're blocking it out, then it doesn't look good. So we have to use the data from 1990 on to calculate the sacraments. Now, if you watched the previous video, this is how we established the apostasy rate in the United States. And we're going to do the same thing here. We're going to see how many Catholics are falling away from the faith, start to finish. So we're going to use First Communions as a reference point in 1990. So we're going to count back about 7.5, 8 years to see how many baptisms were performed. And then we're going to look forward another 7 years to confirmations and then on to marriages. So we have to start with 1990 because that's the first year we have confirmations and First Communions. So we have to use that as a reference point. But I guess any point is good as long as we have data for. But the data that was redacted, chances are those numbers were much higher. And at the beginning, back in 1970, and there was a dramatic fall. And then they started giving us the data of when it starts to climb up, as if to give the impression that things were bouncing back. which you can clearly tell that by the year 2000, it's dropping down again. So we're going to look at First Communions. In 1990, there was 11.3 million First Communions. So go back 7 years, and we should have a number of baptisms. Now, what's interesting is that on the world statistics here, CARA includes baptisms of infants all the way through the age of 7, which is kind of odd because they didn't do that in the U.S. And, you know, a 7-year-old is not baptism. At that point, they should be First Holy Communion or combined, all of it at once. So they shouldn't be considered baptism. So I'm not sure what that means, what that data actually represents, because it should be baptisms done within the first year of the child being born. And actually, it should be much sooner than that. I mean, it should be within 8 to 10 days at the most. But again, not sure why they're saying that it includes all that. I don't know if they're trying to build up that number or if they're trying to compensate for the converts. For instance, in Africa, which Africa still has a high number of children per family. I mean, it's up 6 children per family on average, 6 or 7. So if those families come in, you're going to have a high number of toddlers and so forth that are going to have to be baptized. Now, why they're including that all the way up to age 7 into the baptisms, I do not know. So we'll take it at face value with a question mark above it. So anyway, so if we go back to 1983, you're looking at 16 million baptisms. So 16 million new Catholics were baptized. Okay. And then 7 years later, 1990, we had 11.3 First Communions. And so if we count 7 years after that, for confirmations, you're looking around 1997. So we can say somewhere between 8.5 and 9.3 million confirmations. And then we move on to marriages. So once again, we're going to be using a 25-year age point for an average of Catholics getting married. We all know and understand that in many places it's much higher than that. Somewhere between 29 and 30 is the average. But we're going to give this the benefit of the doubt. We're going to give them the numbers as conservatively as we can. So somewhere between 2.7 and 2.5 million marriages in 2014. Okay, so there is, and remember, marriages, you have to double that because it's 2 people. So if it says 2 million, it's actually 4 million people, 2 million marriages. And just to make sure we're as conservative as we can with these numbers, we're going to total up the marriages, including marriages to non-Catholics. So at least one of the persons getting married is Catholic, the other person is not. So, it's about 250,000 people a year, roughly. But we're going to include those in there because at least one of them is Catholic. So we're going to include as many as we can in this data. Okay, so now let's calculate all this out. So for baptisms, we're going to use 16.4 million as the number. Now, that includes, obviously, according to the data here, baptisms all the way up to the age 7. Whatever, we're going to use that number. And we're going to use the higher of the 2 numbers. So because 1983 is somewhere between, probably 16.2, 16.3, whatever. So we're just going to use 16.4 million baptisms, a very conservative number. That's giving it the benefit of the doubt. And then we're going to go to First Communions. And then we see that 11.3 million First Communions. So between baptism and First Holy Communion, we had a net loss of 5.08 million Catholics. They never made it to their First Communion. Now, this is not just the children. You have to remember the children are dependent on their parents. So their parents didn't take them to get First Communion, didn't take them to catechism. Where do those people go? They fell away from the faith. They are in apostasy. Okay? And then if we can go on to confirmations. So confirmations, we had 9.3 million confirmations out of the 16.4 million baptisms. So 16.4 million baptisms, and confirmations was only 9.3. So that's a 7.15 million net loss. Okay, 44% of the baptisms that were done in 1983, 44% never made it to their confirmations. Now let's look at marriages. So you figure marriages 2.7 million. But remember, we're going to include the marriages between non-Catholics. So although it says 2.7 on there, the little asterisk, we're going to use the 3.0 number. So 3.0, 3 million total Catholic marriages. You have to double that because it's between two people. So we have 6 million total marriages, or 6 million people that got married. And if you subtract that from the 16.4, you are left with 10.5 million people that fell away from the faith. Never made it to their sacrament of marriage. Okay? More than likely, they got married somewhere, but it was not a sacramental marriage, and it was not in the church. 64% of the children that were baptized in 1983 never made it to their sacrament of marriage. They have lost the faith. That's part of being a Catholic, is to receive the sacraments. So what does 1.2 billion Catholics mean? It's an incomplete number because it does not tell us how many people are observing the faith. It only tells how many people have been baptized into the faith. As you can clearly see, year over year, we lose, on average, 10 million people. But they still count them as Catholics. But they're by no means in communion with the church. They are in apostasy, possibly heresy. Whenever you see that number, whenever you see numbers of the churches growing, that means nothing if you don't have the numbers to how many people are keeping the faith. When you compare it to the population, it is evident and clear that the church has no interest in growing God's kingdom. The church as a whole has lost the faith.